I didn't feel the needle go in. I remember staring at the ceiling tiles in the procedure room, counting the little holes in each square, trying to stay still while the technician harvested the marrow from my hip bone. The anesthesia had worn off more than they expected, and there was a deep, grinding ache that I can only describe as something being taken from the very center of me, which, I suppose, is exactly what was happening. I didn't move. I didn't complain. Because 2 floors above me, my son was waiting. My name is Walter. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years building a carpentry business in Columbus, Ohio, custom cabinets, hardwood floors, the kind of work that leaves sawdust in your lungs and calluses on your hands that never fully go away. I raised my son alone after his mother passed when he was 11. I taught him to drive in an empty church parking lot on a Sunday morning. I sat in the front row at his college graduation with a disposable camera because I didn't trust myself to figure out the digital one in time. I know what it means to love someone so completely that their pain becomes your pain, their fear becomes your fear. So when the oncologist called me on a Tuesday afternoon in February and told me my son had been diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia, I didn't hesitate. Not for a single second. What do I need to do? I asked. That's the only question a father knows how to ask. They tested me first as a potential bone marrow donor. The odds weren't high even between biological relatives. A full match is never guaranteed. But the transplant coordinator called me back within a week. She had a careful, measured voice, the kind you develop when you spend your days delivering news that changes people's lives. "Mr. Harmon," she said, "you're a 10 out of 10 match." I sat down on the kitchen floor right there. My legs just went out from under me. I pressed my back against the cabinets I'd built myself 20 years ago, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since the day we buried my wife, except this time they were the other kind of tears. I want you to understand who my son was to me before all of this. He wasn't perfect. He had a temper when he was younger, a stubborn streak that could wear you down. His wife, my daughter-in-law, I had never completely warmed to her. She had a way of looking at things, at people, like she was calculating their value. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself she made my son happy. I let it go the way parents do, because the alternative is losing your child, and no price is worth that. They lived 40 minutes away, in a newer development outside of Dublin. Nice house, 2 cars, the kind of life that looks stable from the outside. My son had a good job in logistics management. My daughter-in-law worked in real estate. They had money. Not my kind of money. I had worked for mine, board by board, contract by contract, but they were comfortable. When my son got sick, I watched my daughter-in-law's face change. Not with grief, with calculation. I saw it, and I pushed the thought away, ashamed of myself for thinking it. The marrow donation procedure was scheduled for a Thursday in late April. The weeks leading up to it involved injections to stimulate my bone marrow production, which caused an aching in every joint that made it hard to sleep. I didn't tell my son how uncomfortable it was. I didn't want him to feel guilty. He was fighting for his life. My discomfort was nothing. 2 nights before the procedure, my son and my daughter-in-law came to my house for dinner. I made pot roast, the way his mother used to. We sat at the kitchen table, and my son looked thinner than I'd ever seen him, the skin around his eyes dark and sunken, but his smile was still the same smile from the church parking lot, from the front row of that graduation. My boy. After dinner, my daughter-in-law spread some papers on the table. She said they were from the hospital's administrative office financial coordination documents, she called them. She explained that because I was listed as my son's emergency contact and next of kin, there were liability forms I needed to sign, consent documents related to the procedure, standard protocol for living donors in case of complications. My son looked tired. He said, "Dad, it's just paperwork. You know how hospitals are." I know exactly how hospitals are. I know they bury you in forms. I had already signed approximately 40 documents that month. I pulled the stack toward me, and my daughter-in-law pointed to the signature lines, one after another, while she talked about the procedure schedule, about the recovery ward, about where they'd be waiting. She kept talking. I kept signing. My son reached over and squeezed my arm, and I was looking at his face, not the papers. I signed everything she put in front of me. I want you to live with that for a moment, because I have lived with it every day since. I signed everything she put in front of me. and I thought I was signing consent forms for a medical procedure that might save my child's life. I thought I was doing the last piece of paperwork before the most important thing I would ever do. The procedure itself went as expected, though the partial anesthesia failure made it longer and harder than the team anticipated. I spent that first night in the hospital in a room on the third floor, drifting in and out of a heavy, chemical sleep, dreaming about sawdust and the smell of cedar. In the morning, a young nurse named Diane came to check my vitals. She asked how I was feeling, and I told her honestly sore, but good. She smiled and said the transplant team was pleased with the initial results. She said my son was resting and that his wife was with him. I asked if I could see him. Diane hesitated just briefly, just a flicker, and said she'd check with the care team. The care team never came. Diane came back twice that day with medications and meals, and each time I asked, she gave me the same answer. My son was resting. He needed to remain in a controlled environment to minimize infection risk. She said she was sure he'd reach out when he was feeling stronger. On the second day, I called my son's cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called my daughter-in-law. She picked up on the second ring. She sounded perfectly calm when she explained that my son was being transferred to a long-term care facility for his recovery, a specialized unit with controlled air filtration, strict visitor protocols, months of monitoring ahead. She said it was what was best for him. She said the medical team had recommended they minimize outside contact to reduce infection risk. When can I see him? I asked. She said she wasn't sure. She said these things take time. She said she'd be in touch. She wasn't in touch. On the third day, I was cleared for discharge. My hip was stiff and bruised from the procedure, and the nurses had me walk the hallway twice before they'd let me go. A hospital social worker came by in the afternoon. A man about 40 with reading glasses pushed up on his head, and he pulled a chair up beside my bed. He told me there was a situation he needed to discuss with me. His name was Mr. Delaney. He had a file folder in his lap, and he spoke quietly, the way people do when the news is bad and the walls are thin. He told me that the documents I had signed 2 nights before the procedure were not hospital consent forms. I remember the light in the room looking different after he said that, like the bulb had shifted frequency. The papers I had signed, he explained, included a quitclaim deed transferring ownership of my home to my son and my daughter-in-law. They also included a financial power of attorney granting my daughter-in-law authority over my bank accounts, my retirement fund, and any assets held in my name. They also included a residency agreement for a place called Meadow Glen Senior Living, where a 6-month stay had already been paid for using a $47,000 withdrawal from my savings account that had been processed 3 days before the procedure, while I was in the middle of injection treatments and not sleeping and signing whatever anyone put in front of me. My house, my savings, my retirement. Gone. I remember asking Mr. Delaney to say it again. He did. I remember asking him if he was certain. He turned the folder toward me and showed me copies of my own signatures, my own handwriting, on documents I had never read. I have built things my entire life. I have measured and cut and fitted and sanded, and I know the weight of what you can make with your hands. I know what it costs. I sat in that hospital bed and felt the weight of 31 years become nothing. 31 years of early mornings and late invoices, and sawdust in my lungs, and my son and his wife had taken it while I was unconscious on a procedure table 2 floors below him, giving him the marrow from my own bones. I don't have a word for what that feels like. I'm not sure one exists. Mr. Delaney told me he had notified the hospital's legal office that morning. He told me that the circumstances of the document signing the timing relative to my procedure, the manner in which they had been presented, raised serious legal concerns. He had already been in contact with an attorney in the hospital's patient advocacy network. He asked if I had anyone I could call. I thought about it for a long time. I called Margaret. She was my neighbor for 19 years, 72 years old, sharper than anyone I've ever known. She had her coat on and was at the hospital within 40 minutes. And when she walked into my room and looked at my face, she didn't ask any questions. She sat down next to me and held my hand, and I told her everything. And she listened the way only someone who has known grief listens, without trying to fix it, without saying the wrong thing. Then she said, "Walter, we're going to need to make some calls." We made some calls. The attorney from the Patient Advocacy Network, a woman named Miss Calloway, who looked about 35 and moved like she had somewhere important to be at all times, came to the hospital that afternoon. She reviewed the documents with me for 2 hours. She explained what I was looking at in clear, plain language, without softening it. The quitclaim deed was real and filed. My home had been transferred. The power of attorney was real and active. The Meadow Glen agreement was real, and a room was being held for me, with my name on the door. But, Miss Calloway told me, there were problems, serious legal problems with how all of it had been obtained. The timing alone was significant. A person in the days immediately preceding a major medical procedure, undergoing hormonal stimulation treatments, sleep-deprived, under emotional duress relating to a family member's life-threatening illness, the law takes a particular view of documents signed under those conditions. Then there was the manner of presentation, the explicit misrepresentation of the document's contents. The fact that a notary had been present at my kitchen table that evening, a notary whose license I had not verified, who was, as it later turned out, a personal friend of my daughter-in-law's who had never reviewed the documents with me or confirmed my understanding of what I was signing. "This is elder fraud," Miss Calloway said, "and it's textbook. I am 67 years old. I built things with my hands for 31 years. I raised a boy by myself. I have never once thought of myself as someone who could be a victim of elder fraud. I sat in that hospital room and understood, in a way I never had before, that it can happen to anyone. That love is the oldest and most effective tool for exploitation that exists. Meadow Glen was a clean facility. That's the most generous thing I can say about it. The staff was professional, the meals were adequate, the room had a window that looked out at a parking lot. I stayed there for 11 days while Miss Calloway worked. I want to be honest about those 11 days because I think they matter. On the 3rd day, I received a text message from my son. It said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know how bad it would affect you. We can figure things out." I read that message approximately 40 times. I am still not entirely certain what he was sorry for. Whether he was sorry for what they had done, or sorry that I had found out, or sorry in the way people are sorry when consequences arrive earlier than expected. I never responded. I didn't know how. On the 7th day, a young man came to visit me at Meadow Glen. His name was Marcus. He was 26 years old, and he had worked part-time in my shop for 3 years, while he was getting his degree in construction management. He was the kind of young man who showed up early and stayed late and never had to be told something twice. I had let him go 8 months ago when I'd started thinking about retirement, and I had given him a reference that I meant every word of. He had heard what happened through Margaret. He sat across from me in the common room at Meadow Glen, and he looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at me. "Mr. Harmon," he said, "I want you to know something. Whatever you need, I'm here." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Marcus, how did you know where to find me?" He said Margaret had told him. I said, "That woman cannot keep a secret." He laughed. I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in 11 days, and I want you to understand what that meant. Miss Calloway moved quickly. The Franklin County Prosecutor's Office opened a criminal investigation within 2 weeks of my discharge. The case they built over the following months was methodical and thorough. The notary surrendered her license and cooperated fully in exchange for a reduced charge. My daughter-in-law had made several critical errors. She had sent text messages discussing the plan before the procedure. She had accessed my retirement account from her personal IP address, and she had been remarkably candid in emails to her sister about the timeline and the expected outcome. The quitclaim deed was challenged and voided by the probate court. The court found that the transfer had been obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation, and that I had been in a medically and emotionally compromised state at the time of signing a state that my daughter-in-law had, deliberately engineered by choosing that specific moment, 2 nights before my procedure, to present the documents. The house came back to me. The power of attorney was revoked. The $47,000 was recovered, not all at once, not easily, but recovered. The Meadow Glen fees were ordered to be repaid. My son and my daughter-in-law were both charged with elder abuse, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and fraud. My daughter-in-law faced the more serious charges, as the evidence showed clearly that she had been the architect of the scheme. My son and I have thought about this more than I can tell you. My son took a plea agreement. He cooperated. He testified against his wife. He received a suspended sentence and 3 years of probation. His wife received 18 months. I was in the courtroom for the sentencing. I sat in the third row with Margaret on my left and Miss Calloway on my right, and I watched my daughter-in-law stand before the judge, and I felt nothing I expected to feel. No satisfaction, no relief, just a vast, quiet exhaustion. The way you feel at the end of a very long job when the last piece finally fits and you step back and the thing is done. My son looked at me from the defense table. I looked back at him. He was thinner than he'd been at dinner that night, thinner even than when he was sick, as though guilt had its own way of consuming a person. He opened his mouth slightly, as if he was going to say something. The judge called for order, and he looked away. I have not spoken to my son since. I want to be careful here, because this is the part people ask about the most. They want to know if I hate him. They want to know if I've forgiven him. They want to know what a father does with the love he spent 31 years building, when the person he built it for turns out to be someone he doesn't fully recognize. Here is what I know. I do not hate my son. I am not sure I'm capable of it. But love, I have learned, is not the same as trust. And trust, once it's been broken in the particular way his was broken, not in a moment of weakness, not in a terrible accident, but in a deliberate plan, executed while I was unconscious. Giving him what his body needed to live that kind of trust does not rebuild itself on its own. I went home. My house was still standing. My workshop was still in the back, though I hadn't been in it in months. I walked through the rooms slowly, running my hand along the kitchen cabinets I had built 20 years ago. The baseboards in the hallway, the built-in bookshelf in the living room, where my wife's books still sat the way she'd left them. My hands remembered all of it. I sat in the kitchen for a long time and watched the afternoon light move across the floor. 3 weeks after I got back, Marcus called and asked if he could come by. He showed up with his truck. In the bed of the truck was a piece of white oak, 8 feet long, rough cut, the kind of raw material that's all potential before the work begins. He said he'd been given a commission for a custom dining table and he couldn't figure out the joinery. He asked if I'd look at it. I looked at it. Then I went to the workshop and turned the lights on for the first time in 8 months. We worked on that table for 3 weekends. Marcus had good instincts and better hands than I'd remembered he'd been practicing. Teaching himself from books and YouTube videos, building things in his apartment with a portable workbench and clamps he stored under his bed. On the third Sunday, when we fitted the last board and stood back and looked at what we'd made, he turned to me and said it was the best thing he'd ever helped build. I said he'd done most of the work. He said, "You taught me how." I thought about that for a while. I thought about the difference between what you give people and what they do with it. I thought about the marrow I'd given my son, 2 floors below where I lay unconscious, and how it had traveled into his bloodstream and rebuilt something inside him that had been failing. I thought about how a body doesn't ask what kind of person you are before it decides to survive. Marcus started coming by regularly after that. He'd bring materials, or a problem, or sometimes just lunch, and we'd work for a few hours and then sit at the kitchen table and talk. He told me about his father, who had left when Marcus was 8. He told me about his grandfather, who had taught him the value of working with your hands. He told me he'd been looking for a space to open a small custom furniture shop, and he didn't know if it was the right time. I told him about a commercial lease I knew of on Henderson Road, 3 blocks from where my old shop had been. He looked at me. I said I had some capital recovered from the fraud case that was sitting in an account doing nothing, and that I was 67 years old and had no interest in starting over by myself, but that I had a great deal of interest in building something with someone who knew how to show up. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Harmon, are you serious?" I said, "Marcus, I've been telling you for 3 years to call me Walter." He laughed. I laughed. Harmon and Webb Custom Woodworking opened 7 months later. The sign above the door is cedar, hand-carved, the letters clean and deep. Marcus designed the logo. I built the showroom fixtures. We have more work than we can schedule, and I get up at 6 in the morning with something to do, which is the only retirement plan I've ever needed. Margaret came to the opening. She brought a casserole, because that is what Margaret does, and she stood in the middle of the showroom and turned slowly, taking in everything. And then she turned to me with her eyes bright and said, "Walter Harmon, you built something beautiful again. I don't know if my son is well. I hope he is. The marrow I gave him, my doctors tell me it's fully integrated now, producing healthy cells, doing what it was supposed to do. Part of me is still inside him, whether either of us asked for that to be true. I think about that sometimes. I think about the way bodies carry what you give them, even when the person carrying it has let you down. I think about how love doesn't always know when to stop. What I know now, that I didn't know when I sat across from my son at that kitchen table signing papers I didn't read, is that sacrifice does not create obligation. I gave my son something irreplaceable, and I would give it again not because he deserved it, not because the outcome was what I hoped, but because it was the right thing to do and because I was the only one who could do it. That's what parents do. That's what love does. But love is not a contract. You cannot hand someone the most fundamental part of yourself and expect it to guarantee anything. The family you find, the one that chooses you back, the one that shows up with white oak and casserole and stays that family, is not a consolation prize. It is not the second option after the real one failed. It is, I have come to understand, exactly what it was always meant to be. I am 67 years old. I get up at 6 in the morning. I go to a shop with my name on the door and the name of a young man who calls me Walter and who learned everything I taught him. I eat lunch at the kitchen table my wife loved. I run my hand along the cabinets I built 20 years ago. There is sawdust in my lungs and calluses on my hands that never go away. I am exactly where I belong. If you have ever given everything to someone and been handed nothing back, I want you to hear this. What was taken from you was real, and the pain of it is real, and you do not have to minimize either one. But what was taken from you is not all of you. The part that knew how to love that much, that part is still there. It is waiting for somewhere worth going. It is never too late to build something that lasts. And if you're watching this, and something in this story felt familiar, if you've ever signed papers you didn't fully read because you trusted the wrong person, or if someone you loved used your love against you, please tell someone. Tell a neighbor. Tell an attorney. Tell the hospital social worker with the reading glasses on his head. There are people whose entire job is to help you reclaim what was taken, and they are better at it than you might think. You are not alone in this. Leave a comment below and tell me, would you have made the same choice I did? Would you have given everything for your child, knowing what I know now? I read every single one, and I want to hear from you. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to stay, there's more coming. Stories about love and betrayal and the people who surprise you most. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.